The moment 3 lawyers showed up at my front door, I knew somebody in the neighborhood had made a very expensive mistake. It was 8:03 on a quiet Saturday morning when the first knock echoed through the house. I was standing in my kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee still hanging in the air, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor through the eastern windows. Most weekends followed the same routine. Coffee, a few hours reading case files, time in the garden, peace and quiet. That morning was different. The knock came again, louder this time. Not impatient, deliberate, professional. The kind of knock people use when they arrive carrying authority they believe cannot be challenged. I set my coffee mug on the counter and glanced toward the security monitor mounted near the hallway. 3 men stood on my front porch. Dark suits, leather briefcases, thick folders tucked beneath their arms. Their posture alone told me everything I needed to know. They were not neighbors. They were not salesmen. And they certainly were not friends stopping by unexpectedly. I tapped the monitor and enlarged the image. One of them adjusted his tie. Another checked paperwork. The third looked directly at the doorbell camera, as though rehearsing what he planned to say. That was when I noticed the logo on the folder. A law firm. A very expensive law firm. I leaned back against the counter and smiled. Because I already knew exactly who had sent them. Linda Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. For nearly 8 months, she had made it her personal mission to turn my quiet life into a community project. First came the warning letters. Then came the violation notices. Then the fines. Every few weeks, another envelope appeared in my mailbox claiming I had somehow violated a rule that nobody had cared about for years. The funniest part was that every accusation fell apart the moment actual regulations were examined. Yet Linda never seemed interested in facts. She preferred confidence. Confidence is dangerous when it is not supported by knowledge. The lawyers knocked a third time. Through the monitor, I watched one of them glance at his watch. They clearly expected resistance. Maybe an argument. Maybe fear. Maybe a homeowner scrambling to avoid legal trouble. What they did not expect was me. I walked upstairs toward my study. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily as I passed. Morning sunlight illuminated framed photographs and shelves lined with books collected over decades. At the end of the hall stood a closet. Inside hung a black judicial robe. I had worn it thousands of times throughout my career. Yet somehow I had a feeling this particular morning would make it memorable. As I slipped it on, another knock echoed through the house. Calm, professional, persistent. I straightened the collar, adjusted the sleeves, and headed back downstairs. Outside, the 3 lawyers remained waiting on the porch, completely unaware that within the next few minutes the entire direction of their visit was about to change. What none of them knew was that 2 weeks later the same homeowners association that sent them would be desperately searching for a new legal strategy, a new explanation, and possibly a new president. My name is Michael Harrison, and for most of my life I learned that the less attention people pay to you, the easier it becomes to see who they really are. That was one of the reasons I chose the house at the end of Willow Creek's longest cul-de-sac. The property sat slightly apart from the rest of the neighborhood, surrounded by mature maple trees and a carefully maintained garden that bloomed from early spring through late autumn. Every morning, I followed the same routine. I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee, read for an hour, and spent time outside before the neighborhood came alive. It was a simple life. Quiet. Predictable. Exactly the way I liked it. Most of my neighbors knew very little about me. They knew I was polite. They knew I kept my property maintained. They knew I preferred privacy. Beyond that, they mostly filled in the blanks themselves. People often do. They see a man living alone in a comfortable home and create their own explanations. Some assumed I was retired. Others believed I had sold a business years ago. A few thought I worked remotely for some consulting firm. Nobody ever asked directly, and I never volunteered the answer. My profession was not a secret. It simply was not something I discussed while trimming hedges or collecting mail. Over the years, I learned that titles change how people behave. Remove the title, and you discover who they truly are. My days were remarkably ordinary. I spent time reviewing legal journals, reading case studies, and staying current on developments that interested me. Afternoons often involved gardening. I enjoyed the precision of it. There was something satisfying about planting carefully, maintaining patiently, and watching results appear over time. The same principle applied to most things in life. Patience produced better outcomes than force. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that philosophy. About a year after I moved into Willow Creek, I began hearing one name more frequently than any other: Linda Whitmore. At first it was harmless. A neighbor mentioned a disagreement over mailbox colors. Another resident laughed about receiving a warning regarding decorative lights. Then I heard stories involving landscaping, driveway repairs, fences, and parking rules. Linda appeared in every conversation. The common theme was always the same. She believed she knew what was best for everyone else. The first time she approached me personally was on a warm Saturday afternoon while I was planting flowers near the front walkway. The scent of fresh soil filled the air, and bees moved lazily between nearby blossoms. Linda introduced herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Within 5 minutes, she had already informed me about several community expectations, 2 recommendations, and 1 concern she claimed required immediate attention. I listened politely. Then I thanked her and returned to my gardening. Most people would have interpreted that as the end of the conversation. Linda viewed it as the beginning. Looking back now, that moment marked the first step toward the knock that echoed through my house on that Saturday morning. Because some people cannot tolerate being ignored. And Linda Whitmore had just found someone who refused to be intimidated by a title. The more I observed Linda Whitmore, the more I realized she treated the Homeowners Association less like a community organization and more like a personal kingdom. Some people volunteer because they want to help. Others volunteer because they enjoy being in charge. Linda belonged firmly in the second category. Over time, stories about her became almost impossible to avoid. Every neighborhood gathering seemed to produce another example. One resident received a warning because a flower bed extended several inches beyond what Linda considered acceptable. Another was told to repaint a mailbox that looked perfectly fine to everyone else. A retired couple received repeated notices over a decorative bench that had been sitting on their porch for years without complaint. None of the issues were particularly important on their own. What mattered was the pattern. Linda always seemed to be searching for another battle. One autumn afternoon, I attended a community meeting out of simple curiosity. The clubhouse smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. Folding chairs filled the room. Residents chatted quietly while waiting for the meeting to begin. Linda stood at the front beside a projection screen, reviewing notes and organizing documents. When the meeting started, she moved through the agenda with the confidence of someone who expected agreement before speaking. Maintenance updates, landscaping projects, budget discussions. Everything seemed normal until she shifted the conversation toward enforcement. Suddenly, the tone changed. Several slides appeared listing violations, concerns, and compliance matters. Linda spoke about standards, expectations, community values. Listening from the back row, I noticed something interesting. She rarely discussed rules in terms of what the documents actually said. Instead, she discussed them in terms of what she believed they should mean. There is a significant difference between those two things. After the meeting, a few residents lingered in small groups discussing various issues. More than one person rolled their eyes when Linda's name came up. Others simply seemed tired. Nobody appeared frightened of her. They were exhausted by the constant pressure. The strange part was that Linda genuinely seemed convinced she was helping. That made her more dangerous than someone acting out of obvious selfishness. She viewed disagreement as resistance rather than feedback. To her, anyone challenging her decisions became a problem that needed to be managed. Unfortunately, that category eventually included me. The situation escalated gradually at first. A comment about landscaping. A question about decorative lighting near my driveway. A complaint regarding storage in a side yard that could not even be seen from the street. Each issue arrived through official channels. Each carried the same tone. Polite on the surface, controlling underneath. I responded the same way every time. Calmly, respectfully, with documentation. Linda did not seem accustomed to that. Most people either complied immediately or became emotional. I did neither. Looking back, I think that frustrated her more than outright resistance would have. She could not predict me. She could not pressure me. She could not intimidate me. And perhaps most importantly, she could not understand why. One evening, while collecting mail from the box at the end of my driveway, I found another envelope bearing the familiar HOA letterhead. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet street. As I held the envelope in my hand, I had a feeling the conflict was entering a new phase. The notices were becoming more frequent. The language was becoming more aggressive. And somewhere behind those letters Linda Whitmore was becoming increasingly determined to win a fight she did not fully understand. The paper war began shortly after that. Every week seemed to bring a new envelope. Some arrived by mail. Others appeared taped to my front door. A few were delivered electronically through the Homeowners Association portal. The method changed, but the message remained remarkably consistent. Linda wanted compliance. More specifically, she wanted obedience. One notice claimed that a decorative light near my garden did not match community standards. Another argued that a section of landscaping created visual inconsistency. Then came concerns about a small free library box near the edge of my property that neighborhood children had been using for months without a single complaint. Every allegation arrived wrapped in official language and accompanied by references to bylaws, regulations, or community expectations. I responded exactly the same way every time. Calmly, professionally, with documentation. The free library complied with published guidelines. The lighting complied with published guidelines. The landscaping complied with published guidelines. I included photographs, citations, and copies of the relevant sections whenever necessary. The process was repetitive but simple. Facts tend to simplify complicated arguments. Unfortunately, facts rarely matter to someone determined to reach a predetermined conclusion. As the months passed, I noticed a pattern developing. Each time one complaint failed, another appeared. The subject changed. The tone became sharper. The deadlines became shorter. It was as though the objective had shifted from solving a problem to creating one. One afternoon, I sat at my dining room table reviewing the latest notice while rain tapped softly against the windows. The letter accused me of maintaining property features inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. The phrase made me smile. It was so vague it could mean almost anything. I placed the notice beside a growing stack of previous correspondence and realized something important. I had saved every document, every email, every violation notice, every response. Years spent in the legal profession had taught me the value of records. People often forget what they said months earlier. Paper rarely does. Around that same time, several neighbors quietly began approaching me. One stopped while I was trimming hedges near the driveway. Another struck up a conversation while walking a dog past my property. They shared stories, similar notices, similar complaints, similar frustrations. The details varied, but the strategy remained the same. Linda seemed increasingly focused on proving authority rather than solving issues. The most revealing moment arrived during another HOA meeting. Residents filled the clubhouse while Linda presented a lengthy discussion about enforcement priorities. The room smelled faintly of coffee and photocopied paper. As she spoke, someone asked a simple question. How much money had the association spent pursuing enforcement actions during the past year? For the first time all evening, Linda hesitated. The answer eventually came, but not before an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. That hesitation caught my attention. Questions about rules never seemed to bother her. Questions about budgets clearly did. Later that evening, after returning home, I reviewed several public HOA documents available to residents. The numbers were interesting. Legal expenses had increased significantly. Consulting expenses had increased as well. The pattern suggested something larger was developing behind the scenes. Then, about 3 weeks later, I received a letter unlike any previous notice. This one came from an outside law firm. The language was far more aggressive. The implications were obvious. Linda was no longer satisfied using HOA paperwork. She was preparing to bring attorneys into a dispute that should never have existed in the first place. And judging from the confidence of that letter, she believed she had already won. The arrival of the law firm changed the atmosphere almost immediately. Up until then, the conflict had felt like an annoying neighborhood dispute. The moment outside attorneys became involved, it transformed into something else entirely. The first letter arrived on heavy paper with a polished letterhead and language clearly designed to intimidate. It referenced potential legal remedies, enforcement actions, and consequences if certain alleged violations were not corrected. Reading it felt like watching someone attempt to build a house on a foundation that did not exist. The confidence was impressive. The legal substance was not. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and reviewed every page carefully. The morning sun illuminated the stack of documents beside me. Years of correspondence occupied nearly an entire corner of the table. Violation notices, emails, HOA newsletters, meeting minutes, budget reports, responses, photographs. Everything remained organized in chronological order. Experience had taught me that facts become more valuable over time. The people creating the letters rarely understand that. They assume the newest document matters most. Often the oldest one changes everything. Over the next several weeks, additional letters arrived. Each seemed slightly more aggressive than the last. Curiously, the allegations themselves never became stronger. The language became stronger. The evidence did not. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, I attended an HOA meeting where legal expenses appeared on a financial report distributed to residents. The clubhouse buzzed with quiet conversations before the meeting began. Papers shuffled. Coffee cups clinked softly against folding tables. When the budget section appeared on the screen, several residents immediately noticed the increase. Questions followed. Linda answered confidently, explaining that the association was protecting community interests. The explanation sounded polished. What caught my attention was how carefully she avoided discussing specifics. Numbers appeared. Justifications appeared. Details did not. After the meeting ended, a board member accidentally left several printed pages near the refreshment table. I did not read them. I did not need to. What I noticed instead was the subject line visible across the top page. Legal strategy discussion. The phrase stayed with me the entire drive home. A strategy requires an objective. An objective requires planning. And planning leaves records. The following week, another certified envelope arrived. Then another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Linda was escalating. More importantly, she appeared convinced that the law firm shared her confidence. That assumption would prove costly. One rainy evening, I sat in my study listening to water tap against the windows while reviewing public HOA records available to residents. Buried inside several meeting summaries were references to executive sessions, legal consultations, special authorizations, additional expenditures. Individually, none of it seemed remarkable. Together, the pieces formed a picture. Someone had spent considerable time and money trying to pressure a homeowner into submission over issues that grew weaker each time they were examined. The strangest part was that nobody ever attempted a serious conversation. Nobody asked questions. Nobody sought clarification. They skipped directly to enforcement. As the weeks passed, the letters became less frequent. At first that seemed odd. Then I realized what had happened. The paperwork phase was ending. Somewhere behind closed doors, Linda had decided documents alone were no longer enough. She wanted something bigger, something dramatic, something that would finally force compliance. And judging by the sudden silence from both the HOA and the law firm, I suspected preparations were already underway for the visit that would eventually bring 3 attorneys to my front porch. Saturday arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that makes an entire neighborhood feel peaceful and predictable. Birds moved between the maple trees lining the street. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across manicured lawns. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed to life. It would have been a perfectly ordinary morning if not for the 3 attorneys standing on my front porch. By the time I reached the front hallway, they had already knocked several times. Through the security monitor, I watched them exchange brief comments while checking the folders they carried. They looked confident, prepared, certain of the outcome. That certainty interested me. Confidence is a useful thing when it is supported by facts. When it is supported only by assumptions, it tends to create memorable moments. I paused beside the entry table and glanced once more at the stack of HOA correspondence I had preserved over the previous months. Every notice remained organized by date. Every email had been archived. Every response had been documented. The collection represented nearly a year of unnecessary escalation. Linda had begun with complaints, then violations, then fines, then attorneys. Each step had followed the same pattern. When one tactic failed, she simply moved to the next. What she never seemed to realize was that escalation creates records. Records create timelines. Timelines create accountability. Another knock echoed through the house. I adjusted the sleeves of the robe and walked toward the door. The polished wood floor reflected the morning sunlight streaming through nearby windows. Everything felt strangely calm. Not because I knew what the attorneys were going to say, because I already knew what they were not going to find. They were not going to find fear. They were not going to find confusion. And they certainly were not going to find someone unprepared for the conversation. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The attorney standing closest to the entrance began his introduction before stopping midway through the first sentence. His eyes moved from my face to the robe, then back to my face. The second attorney noticed the same thing almost immediately. The third remained silent, studying me carefully. The change in body language was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders stiffened. Expressions shifted. The confidence that had been visible through the camera only moments earlier suddenly became caution. The lead attorney cleared his throat and attempted to continue. His voice sounded noticeably different now, more measured, more careful. He explained that they represented the Homeowners Association and wished to discuss several outstanding concerns. I listened politely without interrupting. When he finished, I simply nodded and asked a few questions. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. Basic questions regarding documentation, authority, and procedure. The kind of questions that become very important when lawyers arrive carrying demands. As the conversation continued, one of the attorneys glanced toward a framed photograph visible through the open doorway. Then his eyes widened slightly. Recognition. Not certainty yet. Recognition. A few seconds later, he looked at the nameplate mounted beside the entry hall. That was the moment everything changed. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. And standing there on that quiet Saturday morning, I realized that somebody had finally connected the last piece of the puzzle. The attorney nearest the door was the first to speak. His voice had lost the certainty it carried only minutes earlier. He glanced once more at the nameplate inside the hallway, and then at the framed photograph hanging beside it. Recognition had turned into confirmation. I could see it happen in real time. The man knew exactly who I was. More importantly, he knew what that meant. The atmosphere shifted so quickly it almost felt physical. Moments earlier, the visit had been structured around demands. Now it revolved around caution. The lead attorney carefully adjusted the folder in his hands and asked whether we might continue the conversation at another time. The request surprised even the other two lawyers. They exchanged brief looks, but said nothing. I simply nodded and asked whether they had brought copies of the documentation supporting the association's position. Another silence followed. One attorney flipped through several pages. Another looked toward the driveway. The answer, apparently, was no. What they possessed were allegations, summaries, and instructions provided by the Homeowners Association. What they did not possess was the level of evidence they had expected to need. That realization became more obvious with every passing second. Eventually, the lead attorney thanked me for my time and explained that they would need to review certain matters internally before proceeding further. His choice of words interested me. Review certain matters. Attorneys rarely say things like that unless new information has entered the equation. After they left, I watched from the front window as they stood beside their vehicles for nearly 10 minutes. One made a phone call. Another reviewed documents. The third simply stared toward my house. Then they departed. By noon, the first rumors had already begun circulating through the neighborhood. Willow Creek was not a large community. News traveled quickly. By evening, several residents had contacted me asking versions of the same question. Had something happened with the HOA attorneys? I politely declined to discuss it. The less I said, the more people speculated. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the neighborhood, Linda Whitmore was learning information she probably should have discovered months earlier. 2 days later, another HOA meeting took place. I did not attend, but several residents later described it in remarkable detail. According to them, Linda appeared unusually tense. Questions about enforcement costs surfaced almost immediately. Then came questions regarding the law firm. Residents wanted updates. They wanted results. They wanted justification for the growing legal expenses appearing in association records. Linda's answers reportedly lacked their usual confidence. That detail mattered. Confidence had always been her greatest asset. The moment it began disappearing, people noticed. Later that week, additional records became available through routine HOA disclosures. Legal expenditures had increased again. Consulting costs had increased as well. Several homeowners began comparing numbers from previous years. Patterns emerged. Discussions spread. What started as a dispute involving one homeowner was quietly becoming a broader conversation about leadership, priorities, and accountability. And through all of it, one fact remained unchanged. The 3 attorneys who arrived at my door so confidently on Saturday morning never returned. Because by the time they left, the story they thought they were investigating had become something entirely different. They arrived believing they represented authority. They left realizing they needed to understand it first. The second twist arrived about 10 days later, and unlike the first one, it had nothing to do with who I was. It had everything to do with what Linda and the association had been doing behind the scenes. The entire situation began attracting more attention from residents who were growing increasingly concerned about rising expenses. What started as casual conversations near mailboxes and driveways slowly evolved into serious questions. People wanted answers. They wanted explanations. Most importantly, they wanted documentation. One afternoon, while enjoying coffee on my back patio, I received a call from a homeowner I barely knew. The woman sounded frustrated. According to her, several residents had started reviewing HOA financial disclosures after noticing unusually large increases in legal spending. At first, they assumed the costs were connected to normal administrative matters. Then they began comparing records from previous years. The differences were impossible to ignore. Legal expenses had multiplied. Consulting expenses had expanded. Special meeting costs appeared repeatedly. The more residents reviewed the documents, the more questions emerged. A week later, another community meeting took place. Once again, I did not attend. I had no interest in becoming the center of attention. However, multiple residents later shared recordings and notes. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse was completely different from earlier meetings. Gone was the confidence that had once dominated every discussion. Instead, the room felt cautious. Residents arrived carrying printed financial reports, highlighted spreadsheets, and copies of association records. Several homeowners asked direct questions about expenditures related to enforcement actions. Others wanted to know why so much money had been allocated toward legal strategies targeting individual residents. Linda attempted to explain the spending as necessary protection for the community. Unfortunately for her, the documents told a different story. The numbers continued raising concerns no matter how they were presented. Then came the development nobody expected. One resident submitted a formal request for additional records connected to certain enforcement decisions. The request was entirely lawful and completely routine. Yet the resulting disclosures created a problem. Internal communications began surfacing. Meeting summaries, authorization records, budget discussions. Nothing scandalous by itself. But together they painted a revealing picture. The enforcement campaign had not been driven by urgent community needs. It had been driven largely by personal priorities and assumptions. The distinction mattered a great deal. As more information circulated, even board members began distancing themselves from earlier decisions. Several publicly stated they had relied on recommendations without fully understanding how aggressively certain matters were being pursued. The narrative Linda spent months building started collapsing under the weight of ordinary paperwork. No dramatic confrontation occurred. No explosive revelation appeared. Just records, timelines, numbers, documentation. The same things I had quietly preserved from the beginning. One evening, while organizing files in my study, I looked across the shelves where every letter, notice, and response remained carefully stored. The smell of old paper and leather-bound books filled the room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. It struck me how predictable the entire outcome had become. Linda believed authority came from titles, meetings, and enforcement letters. Reality was teaching a different lesson. Real authority survives scrutiny. Real authority welcomes documentation. And over the next few weeks, as residents continued asking questions and reviewing records, Willow Creek was about to discover just how expensive false confidence could become. The final chapter unfolded quietly, which is often how real accountability arrives. There were no dramatic speeches, no public confrontations, and no sudden moments of chaos. Instead, there were meetings, votes, reports, and records. By early autumn, the conversations that had once centered on enforcement notices and alleged violations were now focused on budgets, oversight, and transparency. Residents who had never paid much attention to HOA operations suddenly found themselves reviewing financial statements and asking thoughtful questions. The more they examined the association's decisions over the previous year, the more they realized how much time and money had been spent pursuing personal priorities instead of community needs. One evening, another homeowners association meeting filled the clubhouse. The room felt different from every gathering that had come before it. The air carried the familiar scent of coffee and paper, But the mood had changed completely. People arrived prepared. They carried folders, notes, and highlighted documents. Conversations remained respectful, yet there was a seriousness that had been absent before. Several board members addressed concerns regarding spending, enforcement procedures, and legal expenses. New proposals were introduced. Additional oversight measures were discussed. Residents asked questions and expected clear answers. For the first time in a long while, the focus remained on facts rather than personalities. By the end of the meeting, leadership changes were approved. New procedures required greater transparency before significant legal actions could be authorized. Budget reviews became more detailed. Communication standards improved. The community had learned an expensive lesson, but it had learned one nonetheless. Linda Whitmore no longer occupied the position she once held so confidently. Her influence faded not because someone attacked her, but because residents reached their own conclusions after examining the evidence. In many ways, that outcome was more powerful than any argument could have been. People trust what they discover for themselves. As for me, life returned to normal remarkably quickly. The violation notices stopped. The certified letters stopped. The endless cycle of complaints finally disappeared. My mornings once again consisted of coffee, books, and quiet walks through the garden. Children continued borrowing books from the little library near the road. Neighbors waved while passing by. The maple trees changed color as autumn settled across Willow Creek. One cool evening, I sat on my front porch watching the last light fade beyond the rooftops. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the neighborhood. The street was peaceful, ordinary, exactly as it should have been all along. Looking back, I realized the entire conflict had never really been about landscaping, lighting, or community rules. It was about assumptions. Linda assumed authority meant control. The attorneys assumed they understood the situation before they gathered the facts. The association assumed persistence could replace evidence. Every one of those assumptions eventually collided with reality. And reality has a remarkable habit of winning. As darkness settled over the neighborhood and porch lights began appearing one by one along the street, I smiled and finished the last sip of coffee in my cup. The people who had spent months trying to force an outcome had ultimately created the records that exposed their own mistakes. In the end, nobody defeated them. The truth did. And that is why the quietest victories are often the ones that last the longest.